When I first got into IT, I started studying some certifications. Now, my first IT job was very low level. It was helping end users with cell phones. It was on a contract. I remember the material covering domains. I think my first certification that I ever actually received was an A+. I remember domains being in there. But because I didn't have a high-level view of what a domain actually was or how it was working, I didn't retain a lot of the information, I don't think. And I know that because my first actual support job or my on-site enterprise job, I remember not knowing how to put a computer on a domain or really what a domain was doing. I knew the word was a concept and I had studied a little bit about it, but it didn't allow me to do my job. So I wanted to go over domains because they can be really intimidating when people start talking about domain controllers and DCO1, DCO2, and re-add it to the domain. I remember thinking that a domain controller was this huge complex process, this huge server, and really that's not the case. As technicians, what we actually use the domain controller for is actually really simple. And the server itself can be a really beefy server. But to give you an idea, the server that you see here, the one that I've been using in my labs, is actually a free version of Server 19 that I just downloaded from the Microsoft site. And I loaded it onto this laptop over here. Now, I'm not saying that domain controllers aren't going to be beefy or don't need to be, so I'm just running a lab. So this little laptop can definitely handle what I need it to do. And when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of users, you're going to get big rack servers if they're not already migrated to the cloud. But we're going to be using an on-premises example, and then once you have an idea of that example, later on we'll move to those new cloud features and how they're actually going to integrate. But for now, I want you to understand a domain controller as a whole, what we use it for as technicians, and what we're actually going to focus on. So let's go over the board here, and I want to give you that high-level view that no one gave me. So I read about domains in a book. I wasn't watching videos, so maybe you guys have a better resource. But I want to give you that overview so that you can picture what we're talking about as we go through and we start working on domains or domain controllers. So if you go to the store and you buy a PC, in general, it comes on a work group. I'm just going to put WG here to represent it. Or as a company, you go and you buy 4 PCs and you set them up in the office. Now, by default, they're on a work group. So what that means is that each one is acting as its own PC. There's no way for us to manage each computer very easily. So let's say I set this computer up. So the first thing that I'm going to do, just like a home computer, just like if you bought a computer online or at a store and brought it home, right when you boot it up, it's going to say who logs into this computer, and you're going to put in your name, and then it's going to build you an administrative profile. That profile is going to be the only user account on this PC here. So if I took this computer and I set it up into an office, and let's say it's for someone named Barb, I would have to boot it up, set it up for Barb, set her up a password, and then she would be able to log into it. And let's say Nick and Andrew and Cindy. So each one of these I would have to go onto and set up a profile. Obviously, I would set up another profile that would be the administrator. That way, if anything ever happened, like they forgot their passwords, I could log into the administrator account and reset their passwords for them. So that's the first problem. That means if Barb forgets her password, I have to either remote in or go to her computer, log in as the administrator, reset her password, log out, and then Barb would be able to log in with a new password. The other problem is, what if Barb's computer goes bad? What if something happens and she can't use it? And she really needs to work, so she needs to get onto another computer. That means that I would have to go over to someone else's computer. I'd have to log in as the administrator or remote in and log in. And then I would create her a user profile, give her the password, and then she would be able to log into it. Now, workgroups are common. They're going to be common at your home. They're even common in smaller companies like mom and pops. If you only have 10 or 15 users, it's not that hard. It's not that big of a deal to have to log into these and manage them. I actually have some clients that I take care of. They're smaller units and they don't use a domain controller. So this is actually how we have them set up. And once in a while, they will forget their passwords. Their computer will go down. And what I'll do is I'll just remote in and either reset their password or create them a new profile, and then they'll keep working, and then I'll do whatever's needed with this computer that went down. But like I said, what if we have hundreds of users, hundreds of computers, let's say thousands of computers in different buildings or different states? Then how am I going to manage all of these with password resets needing to be done all the time or people moving around? That's where this domain controller comes in. Now with this domain controller, it's exactly what the word means. It's just a domain, and it controls everything within its domain. So the beauty of this, I'll build the profiles on the domain controller. So when Barb tries to log into this computer, it's actually not a local account. The computer is actually reaching out and using the profile that I built on the domain controller. And one of the many things that allows me to do is if Barb forgets her password, I can just reset her password from the domain controller. And I don't actually have to be on the domain controller. And we'll use something called Active Directory, which we'll go into, but I want to give you this view before we actually go into it. Another nice thing is that if Barb's computer does go down, she can go to any other computer and log in with her username and her current password. And that computer, even though she doesn't have a profile built on it yet, will automatically reach out to the domain controller. It'll pull her profile information and it'll automatically allow her to log in. Now, just as a side note, these computers are not directly connected to the domain controller. I know I have these arrows here, but these are just representing that we're talking to the domain controller. So these are still connected to a switch, and then the switch has network access to the domain controller, and that's what's allowing us to pull this information or to manage these computers from our domain controller. So this domain controller is the same server or the same laptop that I use for our DHCP video. So it's nothing crazy. It's just another process that it has called Active Directory to be able to manage these profiles and for us to be able to edit or reset passwords or create rules. And then AD is what people call Active Directory. So they'll say, just go ahead and reset the password with AD. They're referring to Active Directory. Now how we connect computers to the domain controller and utilize Active Directory, we'll go through all of that inside of the server. But at first I want to bore you a little bit because I want to show you some things inside of a workgroup, how to check if you're on a workgroup or on a domain or what domain you're on, and then also how to add the computer to the domain so we can utilize some of those services. So like I said, I'm going to bore you for a second. I'm sure you guys have set up computers before, but I want to give you a few examples. That way we can compare them against the domain controller once we get into the server and once we move this over to the domain. I think it's going to really help you retain the information when we take a couple specific examples from the workgroup and then compare them against the domain controller in the process that we use. So in this scenario, this is a small company that I'm managing. I'm the IT guy, and we just purchased this computer and we set it up in the office. We turned it on and it said, who logs in this computer? And the person that's going to be using this computer is an alias that I made up. His name is Brian Smithers. So one way to look at Brian Smithers' account here is if we open up the control panel and we move this to large icons, you have this option here for user accounts. And then here we can manage another account, and I'm logged in as the administrator because, like I said, I want to create an administrative account. That way I can go in and reset passwords when they forget them. So if I go to manage account, and if I click on his name, I can change his password. So as an IT specialist, what I consider a better way to manage this is if I go to this PC or my PC, whatever they're calling it nowadays, and I right click and I go to manage, this box will pop up here. Now, a lot of these options are also in the control panel, so what's nice is I have all of these options in front of me. So you can see local users here, and then users, and I have Brian and Brian Smithers. And these are all of my local accounts. Now, Brian is not an administrative user yet, so I would have to go in the control panel for this, and we would go back into user accounts, manage another account, Brian Smithers, and then this change account type here, and then I can make him an admin. Without those admin privileges, Brian can't even delete a desktop icon. He can't install a printer. He can't install a program he needs, so those are really important. And some companies allow their users to be administrators, and some companies don't. Some companies don't want them to have those privileges because they can download viruses, so that might be a reason that we don't add them as an administrator. Now, how do we see if our computer is on a domain, or how do we get it onto the domain? So what we'll do is we'll click start, we'll type this, and then we'll go into properties here, and you can see in these properties that I'm on a workgroup, and my workgroup name is called workgroup, so that's defaulted. So if you look on your own PC, you'll see the same thing. And then this is my computer name here, so you'll be able to see if you're on a workgroup or a domain. Now, how do we get it onto a domain, or how do we even change this name? It's in the same box. So we can use change settings here. Sometimes I've seen this box default to this advanced tab, so just remember we're in this computer tab up here, and then we can give it a computer description as well, but here's the name, and we'll hit this change button down here. So we'll hit change, and we could edit this computer name if we wanted to, but we would come up and we would put it onto our domain, and our domain is network on Elmstreet, and we'll hit enter. This box will pop up here, and I'll put in my credentials. It'll give me this acknowledgement here that says welcome to my network on Elmstreet domain, and I'll hit OK. It says that I must restart my computer, so you have to restart the computer and then it'll be joined to the domain, so I'll hit OK. You gotta hit close and then it'll automatically restart, or I can restart later. So let's restart now. So now that that computer is on our domain, I promoted it into my server here, so the same way that we did on our DHCP video, this is actually the same server. So if I go tools, I can see DHCPs here. Another way to see what processes are installed on this server, or we call them roles, not processes, but what roles are installed. AD is installed here, DNS, DHCP, and then this is some information I have Hyper-V on this, but we'll get into that in later videos. So we can go to tools up here, because remember this is the default that we get when we log into a server. So we go tools up here, then we go Active Directory users and computers. So this is the box that will open up here, and this is actually your Active Directory. Now you don't have to go into the server to get Active Directory. More than likely your network admins will show you how to add this into your PC, or sometimes there's an admin pack that you can download. So you don't have to go into the server every time to reset someone's password, but if you needed to and you didn't have AD, you could remote into one of the servers and then just go to Tools, Active Directory, and it will open here. So Microsoft has done a really good job, in my opinion, of organizing things. So they use this top-down or this tree effect where you can open things up, but this is normally what you'll see. I have Active Directory. This is my server here, so it's NOE Network on Elmstreet, and I named it DC-01. So sometimes it will just be DC-01, or it could be DC-02. Normally you'll have more than one domain controller, so you might have a DC-01 or a DC-02. One scenario would be if one went down, then the other one would be your backup. Now some people will name these DC-01. Some people won't name them DC, and the reason being is if someone hacks into your network, you don't want them to say, oh, this is your domain controller. So they might name it something different, but a lot of companies still use DC-01, DC-02. Now Active Directory is super powerful, but as IT technicians or IT specialists, I want to focus on what we will use it for. So here's our domain here. You can have multiple domains. So to switch, I'll right click here, and then I'll do change domain, and I can put in whatever domain that I want to go into for my Active Directory. So that's one way to navigate if that's your scenario. But we'll go ahead and cancel out of there because we only have the one domain. Now, if you work for a large company, this could be extensive. So there could be a lot of options here, especially if you have multiple buildings, multiple companies, multiple domains. But this is your base here. So once you learn how to read this, it's actually pretty easy to identify and to navigate. So we have computers here. So I clicked on this, and this is that computer that we've already added. So when you add a computer to a domain, you can see it here, and we'd be able to remove this if we wanted to, and a couple other things. You don't go into this so much. Sometimes when you're troubleshooting a domain, like we're having a communication problem with the domain, we'll go in and delete this and then re-add it to the domain, and I'll show you how to do that. But the thing that we're primarily focused on here is this users column down below. Now you won't see most of these options because you will organize this better as a company. So all of these security groups you're more than likely not seeing, and you have a guest that's always down, but this is actually just the default. So we've added that computer to the domain, but now we need to create a user account so that we can log in and utilize those features. So we have users here, and we can right click and we'll do new, and we'll go down to user. So this is our user box. So Mr. Smithers, which is Brian, and then we'll go to last name, which is Smithers. And then this is his user login, which will be B Smithers. And this is a really common naming scenario. So most companies will do first initial, last name. So he will be B Smithers. I will hit next. He needs a password, so let's create him one. So we have a couple options down here. User must change password next login. I don't want to do that because we're just in a lab. Some companies will do that so that the user can change their password right away and know exactly what it is. User cannot change password. You could check that. Password never expires. Some generic accounts in companies, but because security is such a crazy thing right now, this is almost like a big no-no in enterprise or in companies in general. And then if I want to disable his account for whatever reason, or if I want to disable his account maybe until he starts or something, I've never used this box, but that's there if you need it. I'll hit next. So this will give us a little bit of information about Mr. Smithers. I'll hit finish. Now we can see that Brian Smithers is in the users group. Now on that computer, we'll go into it and we will log in as Brian Smithers. But when we're creating new users, more than likely we're not done. So we're going to go into this properties box of Mr. Smithers here, and we have all of these tabs. So one of the common ones, so we have some information here. So let's say he was in accounting. So I could put that there, and I'll be able to refer back to his AD account or his Active Directory account if I was ever wondering where Mr. Smithers was working. I could do an address. So if he was working in a certain city, a certain state, this might give me some information. If he were to put in a ticket and I wasn't really sure what building he was in or where he worked in the company, so we can go over to this account tab. This is going to tell me some information about his logon if I ever needed it. And then also if he ever locks out his account, this is one way to unlock it. Down here I can set some rules. These are kind of the same rules that when we were setting him up, but if I wanted to go in after and make it so that his password never expired, I could go there. Now this profile tab here is mostly used so we could set map drives or shared drives and a local drive. I'm going to get into a shared drive video because it's something that's really common in business. So we'll leave this alone here and then we'll dive into it in that video. So organization, I could say his job title. Let's say he's the manager and his department would be accounting, and then the company, let's say you have multiple company names, like the company that I work for has multiple groups, so I can put that in here. Now the rest of these tabs you're not so much going to use now depending on your environment. I just don't necessarily dive into these tabs all that much, but this members tab is pretty important here. I could add them to some rules, some distribution groups, some security groups, and the way that I would do that is I would hit add, and then I can just type in here, like let's say he's an office manager, and I have a specific group for him with some rules, so I could type office manager. Then even if it was office managers, so if I type office manager and I hit OK, it's going to give me this error because there isn't an office manager group. So if I do check names, it's going to give me a list of all the rules that start with office manager. And I'll actually cover this in our share drive video that I'll be making soon. I just don't want to get too in-depth. The video can get pretty long if I dive into every single thing, but just know that this tab here, that's what we can use it for. We can add them to different groups. Now, one of the most common things that we'll be dealing with in Active Directory is password reset. So a user will call in, they'll say, hey, I can't remember my password, or I've tried to log in and it's saying that my password is wrong. So we need to reset Brian's password because he just called in and forgot his password. So one thing to remember in this left-hand column here, if you have a whole bunch of folders, so if I were to search just here and do find, it'll give me this box, but it's actually only going to search in this user folder. But if I click here and I hit find, it's actually going to search every folder underneath it. So if you have multiple buildings and you just click on the one building, that might be a reason that we wouldn't find them. So up here we have find, and it's saying users, contacts, and groups. So if I was looking for a computer, I would actually have to use this drop down, but this is the default that you'll usually use. So on the phone, he'll say, yeah, my name is Brian Smithers and I forgot my password. Can you please reset it? So I would just use the last name normally because a lot of people have nicknames or they give you a short name and sometimes it won't come up. So if I hit enter here, it will come up and I'll say Brian Smithers. Now if I right click on his name, I have a few options here. So we're going to go ahead and reset his password. So it'll give me a box to put in his new password. So I will reset his password here and I'll go ahead and confirm it. Usually I'll just ask, do you want your password to be something specific or do you want me to just make you one? So we want to pay attention to the bottom here. There's this box and it's checked by default. It says user must change password at next login. So this could create problems and we really don't want to generate another ticket. So I'll usually uncheck this and just have them use this password until it expires and then they can change it to whatever they want. Another line here that we want to look at is it says account lockout status. So this will actually tell us if they're locked out. So a lot of companies have policies that if you use the wrong password too many times, it'll automatically lock out your account. So you'll see that it's locked here. I usually just click this just because it's force of habit. It's not going to hurt anything if he's unlocked, but this is also a good way to see if they're locked out. So I'll go ahead and click this, changed his password, it'll give me the confirmation. If I were to fat finger the confirmation on the second line, then it might say, passwords didn't match or something along those lines. So I would just say okay. But if Brian calls in and he says, I think that I locked out my password, and I right click and I go reset password, and then in this box I can see, did he actually lock out his password? Now if you've said, yeah, I've tried it 100 times, it's not working. So what this is actually telling me right now is maybe he's using the wrong username. So I might disregard this for a second, click cancel, and then go into his properties. In this accounts tab again, I can see his username. So I can say, hey, are you using B Smithers? And sometimes they'll say, no, I'm using Brian, or I'm using Brian S. And that might give you an idea of what they're doing wrong, especially if you change their password, then you get off the phone with them really quickly. Maybe you're taking a lot of calls, and then they try to log in and they call right back and say it didn't work. Just keep an eye on that. So now that we have Mr. Smithers added here, I do want to talk about this administrative user. So this is one of the only other users. We do have our guest user here. But this administrative user is actually my domain controller administrator account. So this account has full control over the domain and everything that is connected to the domain. So this account has full rights to basically all the groups, all the distribution lists, anything that you build in here. So you more than likely will never have this password unless you're in upper management or a high-level security or a high-level networking position. But the reason that I bring it up, remember that we had that administrative account on Mr. Smithers' new PC. So that account, that administrator account, is not this account. That account has full rights to the entire computer, but it doesn't have any rights to the domain controller. So this domain administrative account is not the same as that local administrator account. And that'll be important when we log back into Mr. Smithers' new PC. I want you guys to be able to tell the difference between these and how to get into each one. There's a little trick to that too. So let's get over to that that PC. And let's take a look at some of the user accounts before we actually log Mr. Smithers in. So we have our RDP session here, and this is the IP of the computer. So you'll see username is our domain /B Smithers. So we want to log in as the local administrator so we can take a look at the user accounts before we actually log in as Mr. Smithers. So this is telling me that it's looking at our domain controller for the credentials. And then this / is actually the separator between where it's looking and what username it's looking at. So I want to look at the local computer that we could see by right-clicking on this computer and going to properties, which is NOE and random letters and numbers that I've named the computer, and then the actual username here. So let's go ahead and connect. It'll ask me for the password, and this is the local administrator password, and we'll get logged in. So we'll click on start. We'll type this to get this PC. Click on C drive. Is your options here. We will get users, and then we'll be able to see all the users that have ever logged into this computer, or a lot of them are just default. So this is the local administrator. This is the local Brian Smithers account. So this is the one before we actually added it to the domain, and then a bunch of defaults here. So let's go ahead and log in as Brian on his domain account, and we'll see what we get. So we have our remote desktop connection here. This is the server to the computer. And then here we have our local computer, and then our separator, which is that / and administrator. So we want to go show more options. So now we are pointing at our domain here, and we have our / that is separating where we're looking for our password, and then the username. So this is the username that we created in Active Directory. We'll go ahead and hit connect, put in the password that we gave him, hit enter. Connect to this, and we'll get this welcome screen, and what it's doing is it's actually building his profile. So even though he's never logged into this computer before, it's going to automatically reach out to that domain controller and then pull down his information, authenticate it, and then build him a profile. So that's that scenario that if a computer goes down, you would have to remote in, build them a profile, give them the username and password, have them log in. It'll just do it automatically. So any computer that is a part of that domain, they can just log into, and it will automatically build them a profile. So let's go ahead and look at that profile list again. So we'll just do the same thing. Hit start, type this. C drive, users, and now we have this bsmithers.network in Elmstreet. So this is his local account. This is the local admin. So these two accounts still exist. We can still get into them and use them. It just won't have any privileges if we've set them. Remember that members tab? We went to his username, we clicked properties in Active Directory, and we had that members tab, and we were able to add him to groups. So if he were to log in locally, he wouldn't have any of those options. Since we're logged into bsmithers on the domain, any rules that I set on the domain will apply to this account, or any access that I've given him through Active Directory, he'll be able to use through this account here. And we can always check who's logged in by hitting start, and I can see Brian Smithers. Now it doesn't tell me that it's the domain, so you can always go here to check, but it's a nice trick if you log in remotely and you're wondering who's actually logged in the computer. You can always check down here. So now we've got Brian logged in and he's working. What if he wants to install a printer, or what if he wants to install a program? He can't because he's not a local administrator. So what we have to do is we have to actually add him to the local administrators group. So we'll go back into this Manage tab, and we were here where we saw the local users, but if we go into this Groups here, we can see this Administrator tab. So if your company does allow your users to be local administrators, this is where we'll add them. So we'll just double click this. So at the top, we have the local administrator. We have Brian's local account because it's a local admin. You will see him here. I had to add him to be able to remote into this computer under his domain name. So what I did was I added another user to Active Directory to be able to show you guys this. So you'd hit add, and let's say we have a new user that's name is Mary B. So I would just put MB, and I would hit this check name. Let's say I take one away, so I misspelled it. And let's hit check. So now we see it, Mary B, MB, and MB at the domain. I can hit OK. So now Mary also has local administrative privileges, and I would hit apply and OK. So we can see our admins by double clicking there and seeing if they're an admin. So if you go to try to install something on someone's computer and it says you don't have local administrator rights, this is a place that you could add them if your company allows it. So back over the board here, this is a really common error that you will see. So what this error is telling us, so we try to log in as Mr. Smithers or Mary B, and we get this. It'll obviously say their name and not administrator, but it says the security database on the server does not have a computer account for this workstation and this trust relationship. So this trust relationship error that we get, so if you see this error, you can take it off of the domain and put it back on. So let's walk through that really quickly. I logged into the computer that we were just working on. I logged in as Mr. Smithers, and the same way that we domain, so right click and properties, we would do change settings, change again, so this computer name tab, and then instead of going onto the domain, we would just go onto a workgroup. Hit enter, and what this is telling us is if you leave this domain, then you have to have the local administrator password. Now we set this up, we know that we have the local administrator password, but if you're unsure, make sure you set one first. So you could check it here, go back to this management box, go to local users, users here, and here's the administrator. So if you see this administrator account, and you say, okay, it does have an administrator account, it's not disabled because it'll have this little down arrow on it if it is. So it's an enabled administrator account, but I'm unsure if I actually know the password. I want to guarantee that, because if you don't, you're going to have to reload the PC. So we'll go into our groups, administrators, and the account that I'm on right now, B Smithers, he has local administrator rights. So what that means is I can change the local administrator password. So I'll go ahead and set this password. This is just giving you an error, making sure you know that you're changing an administrator password for the local computer. I'll hit proceed. I will set my password, confirm it here. Password has been set. So now I know that the administrator account is enabled, and I know the password to it. So now we can go ahead and leave the domain. So we'll hit OK. And it'll take a while before this box actually pops up. So if it's just spinning for a while, just let it go. But now it wants domain credentials to be able to confirm So I'll put in the administrative password for the domain. It'll spin for a little bit. It'll give us this confirmation that we're now entering the work group. Hit OK. So this is the same process as when we actually added it to the domain. So then we'll just log back into that computer, put it back on the domain after logging into the local administrator, and then this error will go away. So that's one of the scenarios that you'll take it off the domain and put it back on, and people will say, just go ahead and redomain it, and that's what they're talking about. So one more quick trick before I let you guys go here. So you can see that I'm trying to log in as B Smithers here, and I can put in his password and get in. So the option's not here because I'm on an RDP session, but normally it will say who logs into the computer, and it will say other user. So if you want to log in as you or log in as the local administrator, you would click other user, and then you would get this screen here. So this is B Smithers. And what we're looking at is the sign into field here, so you can see that it's trying to get onto my domain. So what if I want to log into Brian's local account for whatever reason? Maybe I'm troubleshooting and I need to get onto a local administrator account. So if I type Brian here, it's going to look at the network on Elmstreet Active Directory. So I'll type the computer name and then whatever the computer name is and put that slash. Remember, this slash here is dividing where it's looking for the credentials and then what username it's actually looking for. So now it's trying to look at the local computer for the account Brian, which would work. But an easier way to do this, you can actually point it at the local computer by just putting this period right before this slash, and it will know just to go to the local PC. Now, the only word of caution I have here is if you're using the remote desktop, so see how it's looking at network on Elmstreet, if I put the period here, it's actually going to use my local computer's name. So it's going to be looking at the computer that I'm on, not the computer that I'm trying to get into. So in this case, you actually have to put the complete computer name. So just keep that in mind when you're using this session. Now, I know that was a ton of information and there was a lot of ins and outs, and we were on the domain controller and then Active Directory, but I hope that gives you a general idea of why we would use a workgroup and then why we would use a domain controller. And as IT technicians, it's a really good start to know Active Directory and the basics of it. We'll get into those other features like those members tabs that we were talking about and groups and things like that in another video. Like I was saying, I'm trying to make sure that these videos don't get too lengthy, but if you have any questions, just put them down in the comments. Make sure to subscribe, pass this on to any friends that are starting in IT. I really appreciate you guys. Let's get ready for episode 8.